August 1st, 1943, 7:10 a.m., 8,000 feet above the Libyan desert. Second Lieutenant John Red McCormick, bombardier of the B-24D Liberator Jersey Bounce, 93rd Bombardment Group, watched the amber sun climb over an endless sea of sand. The 22-year-old from Pittsburgh had trained for low-altitude bombing for 3 months. Nothing had prepared him for what was coming. Below his plexiglass nose position, 177 four-engine bombers flew in tight formation, the largest American heavy bomber strike force ever assembled for a single target. Nearly 2,000 men, 720,000 pounds of bombs. One objective: destroy the oil refineries at Ploiesti, Romania, and cut the fuel supply that kept Hitler's war machine running. What McCormick didn't know, what none of the crews nervously checking their instruments could have imagined, was that German intelligence had been expecting them for 3 days, that the approach route had been compromised, that the anti-aircraft defenses protecting Ploiești had been reinforced to a density unprecedented in warfare, and that the mission plan, brilliant on paper, was about to collapse into chaos before the first bomb fell. 288 heavy flak guns, 52 light flak batteries, hundreds of machine gun positions, all positioned around 7 refineries that produced 60% of Germany's petroleum. The defenses were a mathematical equation of death. Any bomber approaching at low altitude would face concentrated fire from multiple positions simultaneously. Survival time in the target area, estimated at 90 seconds. This is the story of Operation Tidal Wave, the mission that would become the most decorated single action in American military history, where 5 medals of honor would be earned in one afternoon, where innovation and courage collided with German firepower and Romanian determination, where 54 bombers and 532 men would be lost to destroy an objective that would be back in production within months. The mathematics of industrial warfare were already in motion, and every man aboard those 177 bombers was flying toward a rendezvous with fire, steel, and a target that refused to die. Germany's war machine ran on Romanian oil. The massive refinery complex at Ploiești, 35 miles north of Bucharest, produced over 30 million barrels annually, more than half of Germany's total petroleum supply. Without it, the Panzer Division stopped. The Luftwaffe was grounded. The Kriegsmarine rusted at anchor. American strategic planners had identified this vulnerability in 1942. Destroy Ploiești crippled Germany's ability to wage war. Simple strategic logic backed by industrial mathematics. The refineries represented a single point of failure in Hitler's war economy. But Ploiești wasn't Berlin or Hamburg. It sat 1,350 miles from the nearest Allied airfield in North Africa, beyond the range of escort fighters, at the extreme limit of B-24 capabilities and deep in Axis-controlled territory. Any attack would require bombers to fly, without fighter protection, navigate over hostile terrain, and return across the Mediterranean on remaining fuel with zero margin for error. The B-24 Liberator was chosen because of its range and bomb capacity. The flying boxcar, ungainly, difficult to fly, but capable of hauling 8,000 pounds of bombs farther than any other Allied aircraft. 5 bombardment groups were assigned: the 44th, 93rd, 98th, 376th, and 389th, nearly every B-24 unit in the Mediterranean theater. The plan developed by Colonel Jacob Smart of the Air Staff was audacious. Attack at minimum altitude, 50 feet or less, below German radar coverage, beneath the optimal firing range of heavy flak guns, using surprise and speed to overwhelm defenses before they could react. Instead of the standard high-altitude precision bombing from 20,000 feet, the bombers would roar across the target at treetop level, dropping delayed fuse bombs that would give the aircraft time to escape before detonation. Each group would hit a specific refinery complex simultaneously, creating multiple targets that would divide defensive fire. The training began in earnest in June 1943 at bases around Benghazi, Libya. Pilots practiced formation flying at 50 feet, dangerous enough over empty desert, suicidal over defended targets. Bombardiers learned to release at altitudes where the margin between successful attack and flying into your own explosion was measured in seconds. Navigators memorized landmarks for 2,700 miles of flight over hostile territory. Major K.K. Compton, commanding the 376 Bombardment Group, told his pilots, "We'll go in low and fast. The Germans won't expect heavy bombers at ground level. We'll be on target before they react. In and out in 2 minutes." What Compton didn't know was that Romanian intelligence had decoded American communications discussing the raid. German defenders had been alerted on July 28th, 4 days before takeoff. They were preparing a reception that would turn the revolutionary tactics into a massacre. The target selection divided Ploiesti into 7 objectives. The Romana Americana refinery, codenamed White 1. The Concordia Vega refinery, White 2. The Standard Petrobloc and Unirea Orion refineries, White 3 and 4. The Columbia Aquila refinery, White 5. And the 2 largest facilities, the Astra Romana and Credital Minia refineries, Blue Target. Each refinery was a sprawling complex of distillation towers, cracking plants, storage tanks, and piping systems covering hundreds of acres. The delayed action bombs would detonate inside these structures, destroying equipment that took years to manufacture and install. The mathematics seemed favorable. 177 bombers carrying 311 tons of bombs hitting 7 separate targets simultaneously. Even accounting for defensive fire and bombing errors, the sheer volume of explosives should cause catastrophic damage. But those mathematics assumed surprise, coordination, and the mission going according to plan. On the morning of August 1st, none of those assumptions would survive first contact with reality. The B-24s began launching from 7 different airfields around Benghazi in the pre-dawn darkness. Each heavily loaded Liberator required nearly the entire runway to stagger into the air. Gross weight exceeded 65,000 pounds, far above normal operating limits. Fuel tanks were topped completely full. Bomb bays carried maximum loads. Some aircraft were so heavy that crews threw out personal items to save weight. The 376th Bombardment Group, the Liberators, launched first at 4 a.m. 29 aircraft lifting into darkness, forming up by the glow of formation lights. The 93rd, Ted's Traveling Circus, followed at 5 a.m. Then the 98th Pyramiders, the 44th Flying 8-Balls, and finally the 389 Sky Scorpions. Lieutenant Robert Sternfels, pilot of Chattanooga Choo-Choo, 98th Bombardment Group, described the takeoff. Full throttle. The aircraft shook like it was coming apart. We used every foot of runway and barely cleared the fence at the end. I had serious doubts we'd make it to Romania, much less back. The first disaster struck before they left Libya. Kickapoo, a 376 Group B-24, experienced mechanical failure during takeoff. The aircraft crashed in flames at the end of the runway. Crew killed instantly. The formation continued. There was no turning back. The 177 remaining bombers formed into 5 distinct groups and turned northeast, climbing slowly to 8,000 feet. The formation stretched for miles, a massive aerial armada visible from 50 miles away. The route took them across the Mediterranean, over Corfu, across Albania and Yugoslavia, skirting known German fighter bases, navigating by dead reckoning and visual landmarks. The flight would take over 7 hours one way. By 7:30 a.m., the Mediterranean fell behind. The formation crossed the Albanian coast and headed inland over mountains. Radio silence was mandatory. Any transmission could alert German defenses. Navigation relied entirely on landmarks and timing. At 9:15 a.m., disaster struck again. The lead navigators B-24, piloted by Lieutenant Brian Flavel of the 376 Group, developed mechanical problems and was forced to turn back. The loss of the lead navigator, the one man who had memorized every landmark on the route, would have catastrophic consequences. By 10 a.m., the formation was over Yugoslavia. German fighters appeared, Mi-109s from bases in Greece. The bombers maintained formation and pressed on. Gunners opened fire. 2 B-24s were hit and fell behind, but most of the formation stayed intact. The real crisis developed at 11:42 a.m. over the mountains of southern Romania. The formation was supposed to make a critical turn at a specific mountain peak to align the approach to Ploiesti. But without the lead navigator and with visibility reduced by heat haze, the lead group, the 376th under Colonel Keith Compton, missed the turn point. The massive formation continued on the wrong heading for 18 minutes before anyone realized the error. By the time the mistake was discovered, the formation had flown nearly 50 miles past the intended turn point. They were approaching Bucharest, Romania's capital and one of the most heavily defended cities in Europe, instead of Ploiești. At 12 p.m., Colonel Compton realized the error and ordered his group to turn northwest toward Ploiești. But the other groups, flying behind and seeing the lead group turn, became confused. The carefully planned simultaneous attack was disintegrating. The 93rd Group, under Lieutenant Colonel Addison Baker, correctly identified the error and turned to the proper point. The 98th Group followed the 93rd. The 44th and 389th Groups followed Compton's 376th. The formation had split into two sections approaching Ploiești from different directions. Timing was destroyed. Surprise was compromised, and German defenders were tracking the massive formation on visual observers, if not radar. The mission plan was collapsing before the first bomb fell. What should have been a coordinated simultaneous strike was becoming a piecemeal attack where groups would arrive over target at different times, allowing defenders to concentrate fire on each wave. In Jersey Bounce, Lieutenant McCormick checked his bomb site and watched the Romanian countryside slip past below. They were 20 minutes from target. He could see the lead bombers descending toward ground level. The approach was beginning. What none of them knew was that German and Romanian gunners had been at their stations since 10 a.m. The smoke generators were ready. The ammunition was loaded, and every gun in Ploiești was pointed at the sky, waiting. At 12:43 p.m., the 376 Bombardment Group descended to 50 feet and thundered toward what they believed was their assigned target, the Romana Americana refinery complex. In reality, due to the navigation error, they were approaching the wrong complex entirely. Colonel Compton, leading in Tegi, and faced an impossible decision. The mission plan called for specific groups to hit specific targets, but they were approaching the wrong refinery. Did he abort and try to reach the correct target, breaking radio silence and destroying what remained of coordination, or attack targets of opportunity? Compton chose to attack. At 12:45 p.m., the 376 Group roared across Ploiești at 50 feet, bombs falling into refinery structures that were not their assigned targets. The attack had become improvised chaos. The German defenders erupted. Hundreds of guns opened fire simultaneously. 88 millimeters heavy flak, 37 millimeters automatic weapons, and 20 millimeters quad cannons that could put up an impenetrable curtain of steel. The density of fire was unlike anything American crews had experienced. Every gun in the city was firing. Staff Sergeant Wilbur Rail, tail gunner on SAD SAC 2, 376 Group. I've never seen anything like it. Tracers coming from everywhere. The sky was full of exploding shells. Orange, red, white flashes. Aircraft ahead of us were getting hit, streaming fire falling, and we were flying right into it. The 376th paid immediately for being first over target. Multiple aircraft were hit in the initial seconds. Brewery Wagon took direct hits in both inboard engines and crashed in flames in the target area. Hail Columbia was hit in the fuel tanks and exploded. Desert Lily had its tail shot off and went straight into the ground, all within the first minute over target. The survivors pressed on, dropping bombs into the refinery complex at point-blank range. Some bombs struck distillation towers and detonated immediately despite their delayed fuses. Others fell through roofs and exploded seconds later, sending massive fireballs hundreds of feet into the air. The bombers flew through the explosions they had created. Several aircraft took damage from their own bombs. Tegi and lost part of its tail to bomb fragments. Multiple B-24s reported flying through balls of fire from exploding storage tanks. At 12:50 p.m., the 93rd Bombardment Group, the second wave, arrived over target. Lieutenant Colonel Addison Baker, flying Hell's Winch, led his group toward the Concordia Vega refinery, their correct assigned target. But the refinery was already burning from the 376th Group's mistaken attack. Baker faced the same impossible choice: abort or press on through fire, smoke, and explosions. He pressed on. The defensive fire concentrated on the 93rd with murderous intensity. German gunners had now fully registered the bomber's altitude and speed. The second wave faced even heavier fire than the first. Hell's Winch took multiple hits in the first seconds over target. Both left engines were hit and caught fire. The cockpit was penetrated by 20mm shells. Co-pilot Major John Gerstad was killed instantly. Baker was wounded but maintained control. Any sane pilot would have pulled up, gained altitude, and allowed the crew to bail out. Baker held steady on course, flames streaming from both left engines, aircraft losing altitude, flying directly through the inferno toward the target. Second Lieutenant David Hughes, navigator on Hell's Winch, survived the crash and later recalled, "Colonel Baker never wavered. The aircraft was coming apart around us. Fire everywhere. He kept it level and straight so the bombardier could release. We dropped our bombs right into the refinery. Then he tried to gain altitude for us to jump. We got maybe 300 feet before the wings separated." Hell's Winch crashed in flames on the far side of the target. Only 3 crew members survived. Lieutenant Colonel Addison Baker and Major John Gerstad would both be awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. The 93rd Group continued through the maelstrom. Aircraft were hit and exploded. Others staggered through on remaining engines. Bomb bay doors torn off, fuselages riddled with holes. But they dropped their bombs. Hadley's harem took a direct hit in the bomb bay while over target. The aircraft exploded with such violence that debris struck other bombers in the formation. No parachutes, no survivors. At 12:55 p.m., the 98th Bombardment Group, the third wave, arrived over the burning refineries. By now, the entire target area was obscured by smoke rising thousands of feet into the air. Fires raged across multiple refinery complexes, and the defensive fire had reached a peak of intensity that defied description. Major John Gerstad's brother George, flying with the 98th, pressed on through explosions and smoke toward the Columbia Aquila refinery. The 98th's approach took them directly over German flak batteries positioned specifically to defend this complex. The carnage was immediate and catastrophic. Multiple aircraft were hit simultaneously. Liberty Lad took direct hits in all 4 engines and crashed. Vagabond King was struck by 88mm shells that exploded inside the fuselage, breaking the aircraft in half. Boomerang lost its entire tail section and went straight down, but others pressed through. Colonel John Killer Kane, commanding the 98th, flew his B-24 Hail Columbia through fire so intense his co-pilot was certain they couldn't survive. They did, and dropped their bombs directly into distillation towers that erupted in massive explosions. Kane's aircraft absorbed over 100 hits, but made it back to Libya. He would receive the Medal of Honor. At 1 p.m., the 44th Bombardment Group arrived. They faced a nightmare scenario. The entire target area burning, smoke obscuring visibility, fires reaching thousands of feet, and concentrated defensive fire from guns that had now been engaging bombers continuously for 15 minutes. Colonel Leon Johnson, commanding the 44th, led his group through the inferno toward the Credital Minier refinery. The approach required flying through the smoke and flames from refineries already hit by previous groups. Staff Sergeant James Applegate, ball turret gunner on Suzy Q, 44th Group, we flew through solid fire. Not just tracers, walls of fire from burning refineries. The smoke was so thick you couldn't see the aircraft ahead of you. Explosions everywhere. Flak so dense it looked like a black cloud. I don't know how anything survived. The 44th lost heavily. Buzz and Bear was hit and exploded over target. Little Buck crashed in flames. Lil Abner took direct hits in the cockpit. Pilot killed, co-pilot wounded, but the navigator took control and crash-landed beyond the target. 7 survivors. Colonel Johnson's aircraft was hit multiple times. 1 engine destroyed. Hydraulics shot out, but he maintained formation and dropped his bombs on target. He would also receive the Medal of Honor. The final group, the 389th under Colonel Jack Wood, arrived at 1:10 p.m. They had been assigned the Stoa Romana refinery on the outskirts of Ploiesti. By the time they arrived, the defenses were at maximum alert and the city was burning. The 389th made their approach through the northern outskirts, flying at ground level through streets and between buildings. Romanian witnesses reported bombers flying below rooftop level, so low that civilians could see the pilots' faces. The defensive fire was apocalyptic. Every gun in the area concentrated on the 389th. Aircraft were hit repeatedly, but most made it to target. They dropped their bombs into the refinery complex and turned for home. By 1:15 p.m., the last bomber had cleared the target area. The attack had lasted 32 minutes, far longer than the planned 2-minute simultaneous strike. The refineries were burning, but so were dozens of B-24s. The bombers that survived turned south toward Libya, nursing damaged engines, wounded crew members, and aircraft that shouldn't have been able to fly. Behind them, Ploiești burned with fires that would rage for days. But the gauntlet wasn't over. They still had to fly 1,350 miles back to base with German and Bulgarian fighters stalking them every mile. The formation that had approached Ploiesti no longer existed. Instead, damaged bombers limped south alone or in small groups, easy prey for fighters. German Me-109s and Romanian IR-80s hunted the crippled B-24s across Romania and Bulgaria. Lieutenant Lloyd Hughes, pilot of Old Cock Robin, 389th Group, had his aircraft's fuel tanks hit over target. Aviation gasoline streamed from wing tanks, creating a vapor trail visible for miles. Hughes could have crash-landed in Romania, allowing his crew to become POWs. Instead, he stayed with his damaged bomber, trying to reach friendly territory. At 1:40 p.m., over southern Romania, the fuel vapors ignited. Old Cock Robin became a flying torch. Hughes maintained control long enough for some crew members to bail out. Then the aircraft exploded. 3 survivors. Lieutenant Lloyd Hughes would be awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. The fighters were relentless. Damaged bombers with wounded gunners and jam guns were easy kills. Avenger from the 98th Group was shot down over Bulgaria. Euroclydon from a 93rd fell to Me-109s over the Yugoslav border. Lemon Drop from the 44th was chased for 200 miles before being shot down over Albania. Some bombers made emergency landings in neutral Turkey. Others, running out of fuel, crash-landed in Bulgaria or Yugoslavia. A few made it to Cyprus, but most of the survivors headed directly back to Libya across the Mediterranean. The flight home took over 6 hours. Wounded men bled out over the Mediterranean because medical supplies were inadequate. Aircraft on 2 engines struggled to maintain altitude. Fuel gauges showed empty as aircraft still had 100 miles to go. Captain Harold Wicklund, pilot of Shoot Luke, 93rd Group, described the return. We had 1 engine completely shot away. Another was running rough and losing oil pressure. Hydraulics gone. Half the crew wounded. And we were running out of fuel over the Mediterranean. We made it to Benghazi with less than 50 gallons remaining. I don't know how. The first bombers began landing at Benghazi around 6:30 p.m. Ground crews were shocked at the damage. Aircraft with entire sections shot away. Tail turrets missing. Engines dangling from mounts. Fuselages so riddled with holes you could see daylight through them. The tail gunner of Ripper 3 counted 365 holes in his aircraft. Susie Q, landed with 3 dead crew members aboard and 2 engines destroyed. Wongo Wongo touched down with no brakes, no flaps, and crashed at the end of the runway. Crew survived, but many didn't come back at all. By 8 p.m., when the last survivors landed, the losses were clear: 54 bombers missing, 532 men dead, captured, or missing, 55 aircraft damaged beyond repair. Of the 177 bombers that launched, only 88 returned to base. Of those, 55 were damaged. The casualty rate exceeded 30%, the worst single-mission loss of the war for the U.S. Army Air Forces. 5 Medals of Honor would be awarded, 3 posthumously. The Ploiesti raid would become the most decorated mission in American military aviation history. But what had been accomplished? Reconnaissance flights over Ploiesti in the following days revealed extensive damage. 42% of refining capacity destroyed. Major facilities burning. Production severely impacted. American commanders declared the raid a success. The reality was more complex. Romanian and German engineers worked around the clock to restore production. Within weeks, output had recovered to 80% of pre-raid levels. Within 3 months, all major facilities were back in operation. By 1944, Ploiesti was producing more oil than before the raid. The fundamental problem: refineries are incredibly resilient targets. Destroying storage tanks doesn't stop production. They can be rebuilt quickly. Damaging distillation towers reduces output temporarily, but the critical catalytic equipment is underground and protected. Unless every single component is destroyed simultaneously, refineries can be repaired. The delayed action bombs have been a tactical error. Many bombs pass completely through thin-roofed refinery buildings before detonating outside, where they did minimal damage. Others detonated before penetrating deep enough into structures. Only direct hits on critical equipment caused lasting damage. Moreover, the attack had revealed the target to German defenses. Ploiesti's anti-aircraft defenses were massively reinforced after August 1st. By late 1943, it was the most heavily defended target in Europe outside of Berlin. Future attacks would be even more costly. The 8th and 15th Air Forces would return to Ploiesti repeatedly in 1944. 24 major raids between April and August 1944. Each raid cost dozens of bombers. The cumulative effect gradually wore down Romanian production, but it took nearly a year of sustained bombing, thousands of sorties, to achieve what Operation Tidal Wave was supposed to accomplish in one mission. The strategic lesson was harsh. Single knockout blow missions against resilient industrial targets don't work. Modern warfare requires sustained pressure, not one-time raids, no matter how daring. The 5 Medal of Honor recipients from the Ploiesti raid. Lieutenant Colonel Addison Baker flew Hell's Winch through flames and defensive fire despite being mortally wounded. Dropped bombs on target before crashing. Killed in action. Major John Jerstad, co-pilot of Hell's Winch, had already completed his combat tour and volunteered for one more mission. Killed in action. Colonel John Killer Kane led the 98th Bombardment Group through the Inferno. Aircraft hit over 100 times but survived. One of 2 living recipients. Colonel Leon Johnson led the 44th Bombardment Group through fires and smoke to hit a assigned target. One of 2 living recipients. Lieutenant Lloyd Hughes continued flying with ruptured fuel tanks streaming gasoline. Remained with burning aircraft until crew could bail out. Killed in action. The 532 men lost represented entire crews. Pilots, co-pilots, navigators, bombardiers, engineers, radio operators, and gunners. Average age, 23. Many had just arrived in theater. Some were on their first mission. The 93rd Bombardment Group lost 30 aircraft, nearly their entire strength. The 44th lost 20. The 98th lost 14. Some squadrons were effectively destroyed as combat units. Of the men who didn't return, 108 were killed in action over Romania. 229 became prisoners of war. 78 were interned in Turkey, later repatriated. The remainder were missing, their fates unknown. The Romanian government treated captured American airmen relatively well by Axis standards, better than German POW camps. But conditions were still brutal. Many wounded men died in captivity. The psychological impact on survivors was severe. Many developed what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress. The 93rd Group, which suffered the worst losses, had to be withdrawn from combat operations for rebuilding. Operation Tidal Wave failed to achieve its strategic objective. Ploiesti remained operational, and Romanian oil continued flowing to Germany until Soviet forces captured the refineries in August 1944, a year after the raid. The casualties were appalling. The cost in men and aircraft was unsustainable. As a strategic operation, Tidal Wave must be judged a failure. Yet the raid became legendary. The courage displayed, flying through fire at ground level into the most heavily defended target in Europe, was undeniable. The 5 Medals of Honor. The stories of individual heroism. The determination of crews who pressed on despite knowing they were flying into death. The tactical lessons learned influenced future operations. Low-altitude bombing of heavily defended targets was abandoned. The Allies shifted to sustained high-altitude campaigns that gradually wore down industrial targets through repetition rather than single dramatic strikes. The raid demonstrated what bomber crews could endure. If men could survive Ploiești, they could survive anything. That knowledge shaped Allied planning for the rest of the war. In Romania, the raid is remembered differently. For civilians, it was terror from the sky, bombs falling on their city, killing hundreds of non-combatants. For defenders, it was a victory. They had driven off a massive attack with heavy losses. Today, the refineries at Ploiești still operate, now producing fuel for peacetime use rather than war. The anti-aircraft positions are gone. The craters filled in. But Romanian historians can still point out where various aircraft crashed, where certain refineries stood, where the Americans came in at rooftop level. A memorial in Benghazi honors the men of Operation Tidal Wave. Another memorial in Ploiești acknowledges the raid's place in history. Both remember courage, on opposite sides of a war that consumed millions. The ultimate verdict on Operation Tidal Wave remains contested. Was it a heroic failure? A strategic mistake? A necessary attempt that simply couldn't overcome the reality of 1943 technology and tactics? Perhaps all three. What's certain is that 177 4-engine bombers launched from Libya on August 1st, 1943, heading toward the most dangerous target any of them would ever face. Only 88 returned, and the men who flew that mission earned their place among the bravest who ever took to the air. At the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs, a plaque commemorates the Ploiesti Raiders. It reads simply, "Courage has no limit." On August 1st, 1943, 177 bomber crews proved that truth. They flew into hell at 50 feet, dropped their bombs through fire, and fought their way home. Some made it. Many didn't. But every single one demonstrated that when the mission demanded the impossible, American airmen would attempt it anyway. The cost was terrible. The strategic results disappointing. The courage absolute. Operation Tidal Wave failed to destroy Ploiești, but created a legend that still lives. And on that August afternoon in 1943, as bombers thundered across Romanian refineries at rooftop level through walls of fire, the impossible became reality for 32 terrible minutes that changed nothing and everything.